Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to China Exchange. It's a very new venture, but I hope all of you will tell your friends about it, because this, I hope, will be a place that you will come back to. We just have one aim, to get you here for an hour to enjoy yourself, but with a bit of intellectual content and intelligent discussion, intelligent Q&A. I am your gatekeeper, so when I open the floor, which I hope to do so as soon as possible because I want to maximize your interaction with our star Lord Foster today, I only have one rule. It's got to be an intelligent question. Otherwise, you will be slapped down and passed over to another person with an intelligent question. Our idea is not to ram China down your throat, but to let you experience the stories of exceptional people who have succeeded in their fields. Some of them have succeeded in China. Some of them might not even have anything to do with China, but at the edge of their mind, they know that they need to involve. I don't see that there's any business in the world today where there is no reference to China. Even fashion, is particularly fashion. If you actually work for a fashion house, you are actually employed by the Chinese. Because last year, 100 million Chinese went around the world spending $130 billion. And 60% of the luxury goods in China this year is actually bought outside of China. So everybody's affected whether you like it or not. And I just saw there was a Chinese boss who took all his employees, 6,700 of them, to Paris. They couldn't come to England because they couldn't get the visas, which is very stupid, but that's something else. Without further ado, I want Lord Foster to tell us about his title, Building in China, and I will then exercise my prerogative to ask him a couple of questions, and then as soon as possible, I want you to be able to put your question to Lord Foster. So, but before that, can I please ask you to join me in welcoming Lord Foster, because like everybody else, he is more important, more busy than any of us, and for him to spare an hour with us is very precious, and I'm extremely grateful. So please thank him with me now.
When it comes to questions, I'm very much part of a team, and I have two of my partners here. Luke Fox, if you put your hand up, Luke is getting on a plane this afternoon to go to China, and David Nelson, when Luke comes back, I think you get on a plane and go to China next week. So without more ado, if I kind of flash back to the 19th century here in this country, for me, full of heroes who had bold vision and could think big. And we still trade on that infrastructure today. We still trade on that heritage. And the exciting thing for me about China and seeking to share some of our experiences there is that what took 200 years is really being compressed in China into around 20 years. So there's a pace, there's a drama, there is a quality of thinking big, something that existed in our past. I mean, this is a wallpaper in 1851, the time of the Great Exhibition. And there was a romance, an enthusiasm, an appetite for change, for thinking big, and a huge sense of optimism. So when we think of our experiences, which go back probably to something like 1979, starting in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, a kind of epic construction with the absolute raw ambition of just being the best bank in the world and having the best facilities, and a great pride in that. And if that was the concept sketch and that's the kind of the big banking hall inside, then the realization of that was rooted in the technology of the day, the extraordinary bamboo scaffolding that made this building possible, the undercurrent of feng shui, which was a very important ingredient, one that we took seriously. I personally commissioned a geomancer, and that was his first sketch on the building. And subconsciously, going back later, we realized that the principles of feng shui in that sketch were followed through in the building. That was a building that was, at that time, and anticipated something that, in a way, on a big project today, you take this for granted, and that is global sourcing. And this was perhaps the first example in the 70s and early 1980s of the way in which a building would be, as it were, prefabricated from elements sourced around the world, in a very familiar pattern now today. And we came back to Hong Kong for the airport. And again, thinking big. If you don't have land, you just get the biggest dredging fleet in the world, and you create a site, and in a period of 4 years, you chop down a mountain, you spread the earth around, and you create then what was, up till relatively recently, the largest airport in the world, and also voted by travelers as the best airport in the world. So a demonstration of the big thinking, the ability to move an airport from the center of the capital, to relocate it, to create a site if you don't have it, and to seek excellence in the process. And the next kind of iteration of the airport, an airport more than twice the size of Hong Kong, emerges in Beijing. And that now currently the largest in the world, of epic proportions, over 4 kilometers long, and very much rooted in the, again, this very interesting combination of cutting-edge technology and the local tradition, here evoking the imagery, the colors of traditional China. So it is a cutting-edge airport at international standards, but unmistakably of the place. And just to put that into scale on a map of London, it just gives you an idea of the magnitude of that enterprise. But then, and again, through the colors, the symbolism, the way in which the outside of the roof evokes the color of the Forbidden City, so many references. But this is really quite a significant diagram, because what this is saying is that the airport, apart from 1 or 2 highly specialized elements, has been totally homegrown, totally fabricated in China. And some of those elements to a level of craftsmanship which would be difficult to achieve now in the West. And if that is the sourcing, then it's quite interesting to compare the time scale, because the time scale of that project was very similar to the opening image of the 19th century in this country. And just to put the scale, again, comparing it with Heathrow, so you've got all the 4 terminals, and more recently, a 5th terminal. And then if you look at the scale of Beijing, it is, in one shot, everything that's ever happened since the 1940s in Heathrow, plus 17%, in other words, plus an unbuilt sixth terminal. And just in terms of size, the last terminal at Heathrow, it is nearly 4 times the size of that terminal. And if we compare the time of achieving that mega airport, it's just under 4 years. And you can see the breakdown in the time to design it, to build it, and then commission it. And if we compare that with Terminal 5, at less than 1/4 the time, you're comparing just less than 4 years with 22 years. What normally happens if I have this conversation over a dinner table is that everybody tells me about party systems, about planning procedures, about democracy, and it's absolutely nothing at all to do with any of that, because if you take out the planning inquiry, the planning approvals, all the things of which we're so justifiably proud, and you take out all the stop and goes, in other words, you take out the blanks in between, whilst people are ruminating whether, having got the permission, we should still do it and wait and hang around. If you just take the construction, the commissioning, and the design, and you say that they're not going to hesitate, and you just put it together, you still end up with something which is significantly longer. So I think it's, for those of us who are engaged in China, there is a wonderful dynamic. I mean, things happen, and they happen in interesting ways. Our experience in China overlaps into other areas. So our work on the Apple headquarters in Cupertino, or our work on probably the largest project in Spain at the moment, or the most significant project in San Francisco, they're all coming out of China, even though they're not in China itself. And the diagram of the sourcing of the Apple headquarters is quite interesting, because it does follow that pattern which the Hong Kong banks set, which is global sourcing. But very interesting that the line that goes out to the glass goes out into China. And this project, simply by its scale, the Apple project, creates, to satisfy the need for the products that will make that building in California, generates the requirement for a building of something like 1 million square feet in China for the specialist glass, amongst other things. And then there is a kind of interesting almost re-import into China itself as the Apple shops open and are proliferating around the country. We go back in mainland China itself to something like 2001 with a project for Juishui, and we've seen extraordinary explosion of that urbanization. And it's quite interesting to see this image on the left of the Pearl River Delta in 1973 and today. And you can see graphically that urbanization, and you compare it with the scale of the greater London area. And if we talk about London as 10 million residents, and we look at the demand in terms of urbanization for space moving forward to 2020, then China will need the equivalent of 10 Londons, or if you put that into the context of New York, 6 new Manhattans up to 2025. And we're seeing some of the symptoms of the of some of the models, the car-dependent city, which has produced, I think it was in 2010, the biggest traffic jam on record, which extended 60 miles and lasted 11 days. And And I think a lot of our activities in terms of the big thinking is seeking to work with our collaborators in China on joint ventures and exploring the potential to humanize that rapid urbanization by the introduction of a quality of public space, a diversification of traffic, an encouragement to bring back the bicycle, which up till relatively recently reigned king in China. So here's an image of a typical project, and perhaps one project which brings forth the principles that I'm talking about is the West Kowloon Cultural District in Hong Kong. And that was the site before our master plan, which won the international competition. And essentially what we did was to try to identify the DNA of an existing city and to use that as a model to expand the city, but to address the issues of traffic and pollution, to show that by higher quality public transport and public spaces, that you could keep the essential characteristics of a traditional Chinese city and expand it, but at the same time solve the problems of pollution and traffic. So we took the typical street in Hong Kong and we analyzed that. We analyzed it in terms of the mixture of uses and the way that those came together. We analyzed the different planes in terms of advertising, traffic, and the proportion of sky, the proportion of roads, shop fronts, billboards, and to take out a lot of the traffic, but to recreate the essential ingredients. And this is the cross-section through the extension of that city. And significantly, you have the area below, which provides, below the pedestrian area, for emergency vehicles, public transportation, delivery, and so on. So you're creating a much more human environment at the ground level. And combining that with green areas such as a mega park. And so really, at the scale of now, many different cities, a mixture of projects, and a number of studios located through there, we see, working with our collaborators, the potential to humanize those urbanizations. And typically here in Hangzhou, to a mixture of buildings, public space, evocative in some ways of familiar models, perhaps such as Rockefeller Center in New York, but always the ingredients of greenery, emphasis on pedestrianization, allowing a certain amount of traffic, encouraging bicycles here on the Bund in Shanghai, a financial district, and accepting the inevitability of large areas of commercial space and shopping. But the emphasis again on pedestrianization, on humanizing the urbanization. Here in Wuhan, bringing greenery, green lungs, pedestrian areas, the same themes moving through here in Shenzhen, very, very different projects, but all with the same principles. And here in Beijing, very, very typically, seeking to add the green lungs and to bring a kind of humanizing influence. That's a very, very rapid scan, which hopefully might provoke some of David's intelligent questions. Thank you.
Well, first of all, that couldn't have been more fascinating. And how much of your business now roughly concentrates on China? I mean, we've seen about 20 sites all over China. I mean,
Luke, David, what do you think roughly?
So you're still working quite a lot outside of China, all over the world. Yes.
Well, we're a global practice, so pretty well most places.
Do you think you have
But then if you take those projects which are financed by China, then that proportion is going to go up because you're going to take significant chunks of North American projects, significant chunks of European projects.
But would you say that you have learned anything from being in China that you might go off to the non-Chinese countries and say, by the way, we did this in China this way, don't you think you ought to? I mean, it used to be the other way around, but
I should be pulling up our proposal for the Thames Hub Airport because it's exactly that. With our experience of the projects that I've shown you here, the airports and other airports, it is relatively easy, straightforward, low in risk. It is so obvious. I guarantee at some point in the future, the nation's major airport will be in the Thames estuary. It's just a question of when it happens. And so we did that project, which was directly based on our experience in Hong Kong and Beijing. And it's staring everybody in the face. And it's a direct descendant of those projects.
well, the precedence of your time scale shows that it will take an extra 10 years because it shaved that from 22 to 12. So you've got to wait for 10 years for the building
We're
approval
quite
to come.
patient. We're hanging around.
All right. But you, I hope, will be still around to start that project. Without further ado, I don't want to hog this at all because I know all of you have got plenty of questions. So starting from you, yes, can we have a microphone there? Just wait for the microphone. Just tell us who you are and whether you're important or not. If you were. Don't touch anything. No, hold on. These things don't have a light. It's very stupid. Foster need to redesign it. The light doesn't come on.
Hello.
It's so stupid. Anyway, here we are.
Hi there, good morning. My name's Aaron, and I'm an architect, and my question's about the future of cities. As we appear to be entering the dawn of a new technological golden age of maybe bio and nanotechnologies, I would like to ask you whether you foresee a kind of a convergence of these technologies into our cities into the future, and how that would translate architecturally and be able for you to undertake your visions, and what that would kind of lead as an aesthetic and a form in our cities. Thank you.
I think in the digital world comes down to the physicality of a city, and I think we can see all kinds of ways in which the technology of adding elements which harvest energy become retranslated so that they are integrated. And so I think there's a certain inevitability in terms of the surfaces of buildings harvesting energy as opposed to retrofitting elements. And I think we've seen that happen in other artifacts, in cars, in aircraft. I think also the technology will have the power to transform the concepts of mobility and public transport. And I think we've demonstrated through some experiments on kind of mini-scale cities like Mazda, where they can be totally solar. I don't know, Luke, David, do you have any views on that, the way in which technology can...
Leave that microphone with them.
Hello? Yeah. I think that one of the things that we are really concerned about is scale, and all the things that you're suggesting will improve cities throughout the world. But the real challenge is much bigger picture. If we're going to provide economic solutions to sustainable technologies, we have to have bigger projects, bigger than the ones that we do. And there's a whole story that can come from that.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because when David's idea of this exchange came up, we sat around a table, David, Luke, myself, and another researcher. We then went away, we broke up because we had a kind of great discussion, and then we reconvened. And it was David and Luke who came back and said, the vital clue, there's a point where you can be more effective because there's a threshold where you can convert waste into energy. There's a threshold of desalinization if it's somewhere that doesn't have fresh water. And roughly, that's around 500,000. And our master plans, by virtue of the mandate, are relatively skin deep. They're more about zoning. And therefore, almost against the kind of small is beautiful dogma, what we need to really move things are bigger projects. And that threshold is
500,000 people.
Yeah.
500,000 people.
500,000 people.
Yes, okay.
Thank you, sir. That was an amazing talk. My name is Melvin Mehta. In terms of
Helena, just leave him the... Sorry, go on.
my name is Melvin Mehta. In terms of David's line of importance, I'm the least important in the room.
Okay, all right. Well, let's have a good question then.
So, my question is in terms of moving from architecture. How did you kind of go and kind of build your team? Because it's about obviously a people business. And how did you kind of choose and select people, and how do you still use those in terms when you identify and grow your team?
I think Luke and David, I mean, you...
Well, I'm the younger one of the group here, from our team. So I think Norman would have to, and David would probably have to answer that in terms of the longer experience. But in China, it's very important having strategic, intelligent, driven people who are from that place. So whether it's Hong Kong or China, there's an essential aspect to having the communication happening as best it can with great architects. Sometimes they are, on Beijing Airport. I was out there for about 1.5 years building it. We had one of the female architects from London came out, Loretta Law, fantastically driven. She'd been educated in the UK, but came out. And she blossomed in China. She was fantastic. And those are key individuals who really can drive the business forward.
Just as a matter of interest, how many young people, qualified architects, let's say, write to you for a job, and how many do you take a year? Rough figures.
Can you remember, Dave? I think
In terms of applications for the company?
Yeah.
Well, we're 1,400 strong
Yeah.
at the moment. We're growing. Most of those are in London, about 200 are overseas. In terms of applications, it's a long process to become an architect.
Yeah.
So,
But let's say qualified architects. I mean, presumably non-qualified wouldn't even bother.
We're growing at about 200 per year at the moment. Of applications, well into 10,000.
10,200.
You can say we're roughly half as architects. The other half, a whole range of different specialists who contribute to the architectural endeavor. Architects are really driving the teams, but with very interesting and very effective research.
I think it's also worth saying is that China's affected us hugely. We have to change the way we do design. We have to change the way that we work. And that's been a gradual process now particularly intensely over the last 6 years.
Language or
No,
what?
how we work, how fast we move.
Oh, I
China's
see.
a very
Much
demanding
faster.
place. When we go for meetings, we'll be all day from 7 in the morning all the way through until dinner. we'll go to dinner and then come back and carry on until about 2 in the morning. You know, it's a very demanding place. They want the best of us. As Luke said, they want people on the ground, young people. They want experienced people from the office. They like a bit of grey hair from London to come out every now and then and actually participate. They appreciate the fact that we'll spend the money on the airfare to
Have
go.
you had a surge of intake of Chinese enthusiasts? I mean, when you've taken your 200 people, I mean, do you find that...
But we have competition. The local Chinese institutes, the design institutes, have been studying all the Western architects that are in China for the last 20 years, and they're bloody good. So it's not an easy ride. You go there, and it's a very competitive
Which other
situation.
nationality is as clever as we are?
Sorry?
We have
The English.
English. All right.
As Brits, we're in a minority in our practice. We have 57 different nationalities. We attract the top students from all the schools. We celebrate their student work. We have a graduate show every year, which is the big social event where everybody who's come in gets to show their student project and to share that with the total cross-section of the practice. And the average age is, I mean, around, I think, 33, 34 still.
Well, next time, if you were to come back, I hope that you have a chart of that global map showing the distribution of your nationalities within your 14,000 people.
When we come back, we'll have that.
Well, yes. A microphone for a man in a safari jacket who thinks he's in a jungle. Sorry, all right, okay, you then.
Okay.
You first. Sorry, your thing is not on. You've touched something.
But we can hear, well, I can hear.
Just don't touch anything. Just speak.
Hello?
Yeah, exactly.
Superb. You spoke about the deglobalization of various parts of the construction from the international suppliers coming inside of China, but design remains in London, and it's a British part. To what extent is that service, rather than a manufacturing part of a project, being taken within China? And will British architecture still be relevant in the future?
It's totally market-driven. It's a competitive world, and if we succeed, we only succeed on results and creativity, and that comes from the mixture of cultures, the mixture of nationalities. It comes from that cross-fertilization between disciplines, and it comes out of a work ethic. And I think that probably one of the reasons why we enjoy China, why we have been successful in China, is that we share the same work ethic. We share the same appetite. I mean, David described it. You get up for breakfast, you're working through breakfast, you're working through the day, you're working through every meal, you continue to the early hours, and you start again early next morning. And if you don't like it, then you go and do something else, you know. That's where you get your buzz, that's where you get the drive. And I think as long as there's that kind of attraction, then I think life will continue to be exciting.
Have you had any case of exhaustion?
Oh, we're all exhausted. But
hi, my name is Enrique. I work in technology. We were talking yesterday with Eric Schmidt from Google about the jump we went in the Western world from PCs into mobile, while China went from nothing into mobile, so they kind of bypass one of the key stages. In your area, there is the intelligent city move. I don't know if this is working. Yeah.
Just don't move it.
So there's the intelligent city move, which I understand has to do with the scale of the projects that you're saying, because it's not only a building, but it's a whole infrastructure. You're doing some projects which are what was it, the culture city, that you were doing a whole development around a specific area. Is there jump into the growth in China from where they were into intelligent cities integrated within the work you do?
I'd say that they have the opportunity to leapfrog. But I think it comes down to the issue of scale. And at some point, that awareness is probably in the political domain, because no individual developer is likely to be able to create the quantum for the real threshold where you can innovate in terms of holistic thinking. And it comes down to the importance of infrastructure. And it starts with that very first image of mine, which was about 19th century transport. It could be the story of the Thames embankment, which brought together for the first time hygienic sewage with the great civic statement of the embankment with public transport. And that really underlines the point that infrastructure is more important than any individual building. The future of cities, the future of society is really the future of infrastructure. So if you come to a country where politically there is a real concern for infrastructure, that is a community that's really looking for future generations. And recently in Argentina, we came across exactly that. It was about the investment in infrastructure. And we were seeing that work. Very interesting. Would you like to comment on that in Chinese?
Well, I think your comment was about sort of the leapfrogging effect. Yeah. So I think that, you know, I mean, what Norman was showing there on West Kowloon and the opportunity to look at those huge master plans, the growth in China, they're having that opportunity to reset and recreate or create new districts, which you can look at from the global picture. It's about the spaces between the buildings, the streetscape, actually defining a new type of urban environment that will shape the development and hopefully the future developments in China, which can incorporate the technologies, the approaches, and urban planning that a lot of other cities don't have that opportunity to do, or other countries.
I hope you asked him to get on with it. I mean, we've been waiting around for that thing to be built in Hong Kong right in front of my house for 20 years.
Hi, my name is Marian. I'm from Startup Grind. How did your work on the Apple headquarters, and especially working with Apple and Steve Jobs, influence your views on smart workplaces?
I would say that that as a project has completely questioned everything that everybody believed was sacred about a Silicon Valley working environment, because the typical environment is a campus of many individual buildings located in a landscape of asphalt and surface parking. So working with initially Steve Jobs and that design concept which was created with Steve now being carried forward by the rest of that team is a rethink of the creative environment. And essentially it's about proximity. And in some ways I can relate it to Beijing Airport. You saw Beijing Airport superimposed on Heathrow, and Heathrow being 5, 6, maybe eventually 7 if it continues to grow, which I think is questionable. But many different buildings, and having to walk big distances, the bags move from one place to another. So everything's dispersed, everything's fragmented. the communality of putting everything under one roof is much more human. It's faster, it's more pleasant, and the same is true for the creative environment. If you create one building, albeit a very, very large building, it is in actual fact a compact community compared with dispersing that over a very, very big site into, say, 15 or 20 separate buildings. Then if you put the cars below ground and in a high-density entrance building, you liberate then on that typical site, instead of it being asphalt, you create a park, a 170-acre park, with jogging trails, walking areas, lakes, and so I think the answer to your question is that it is a total rethink, working together, of the creative environment, because essentially that's what Apple is about. It is about creating things which haven't existed hitherto.
All right, first female question, and then another female, and then a third one, okay? So,
hello, I'm Sophia. I'm one of the airport users. I'm wondering, what is the biggest challenge and difficulty you doing projects in China you've ever faced in the past? Thank you.
Most difficult things about working in China?
Probably speed. I think that actually the whole world's pretty difficult, if we're honest. It's kind of the sort of contracts and the process and the cut and thrust of doing architecture is something that's always played down. It's a very intense experience. People like Norman and I are sort of privileged not to have to get into those kind of fights. Poor Luke here does have to do an awful lot of it.
you're under constant pressure
But it's
to
under
speed
constant
things
pressure.
up.
And they do want the best of you. Will not accept a sort of second-rate approach. They really want 100% full-on from the practice. So when we commit to a project there, we know what we're committing to. It's not going to be a walk in the park.
But that's interesting. I mean, the kind of bad news is that they're really, really demanding. The good news is that they're really, really demanding. And I think as an architect, you respond to the demand for something special. And if somebody wants something special and they're really prepared to work at it, work like hell at it, then for an architect that's good. But I think David's point is very valid. I mean, I'm always saying that a building is like the tip of the iceberg. What you don't see is the big body below the surface. What you don't see is the process. You don't, there are a lot of parties who have to be satisfied in a project.
Well, it's interesting to say that being demanding, very demanding, is the good and the bad. That's like a wife.
We won't comment.
Earlier you talked about, my name is Athena, I'm from Greece. Earlier you talked about...
Have you got any money left?
Yesterday you said the worst country was Belgium, so I'm safe. So you talked about infrastructure and public transport and a community with a will to push for that. Being from Southern Europe, having seen different areas and being aware also of your nice infrastructure in Bilbao project, where do the Chinese stand on that, and how are megacities, are they scaring you at all? What is your perspective in the future with all the megacities? And also having the British on the other side, who at some point of their career or their life, they always try to run away from the city and to culminate, where do you live? Do you live in a city? Do you live in the countryside?
Take it out of opinion. Just look at the statistics. There are more people living in cities than ever before in history. The tipping point was reached some years ago. It's just an absolute fact that the migration to the city is a reality. It doesn't mean that everybody lives in cities, but it's an overwhelming trend.
I think they say that from next year or very near, for the first time, there will be more people living in cities than not on Earth. I think your country is more scary. Right.
I love cities, so I'm very happy with the trend.
But you have a choice. You can
Well,
do
But
I think maybe my
Sorry,
question.
1 minute. Okay. When you finish, can you hand the microphone to two girls in front of you? Because I promised her.
Okay.
But you
I
ask the
don't know where
question
she is,
first.
but yeah.
In
Okay.
front of you, two girls. The girl with the glasses. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, two in front.
Oh,
But
I'm
you
sorry.
ask the question first.
Okay. Sorry, I'm an anthropologist, so I suppose from my point of view, everything's cultural, and maybe this fits in with what you're trying to say. You mentioned how in Britain we're very proud, justly proud of things like the planning process or the environmental process or all the things that maybe we think tie things up, but they actually don't, as you suggested in your talk. But I live in California, and you're talking about a big project, several projects in California, so I wondered if you could contrast those processes in places like California and the UK with the Chinese process in terms of planning and environment, because I know nothing about how that works in China. It's a very broad question.
I think that
Bordering, yes.
when you come to the big project, there are some big projects that you know are going to happen, and the process becomes bureaucratic rather than democratic. And so the comparison that I made with the big project is probably less appropriate in terms of smaller individual projects within communities. And I would say that broadly, the systems across between industrialized nations is remarkably similar. So unless David takes issue, which he may well do, I probably feel that going through the process of getting a consent for a building in New York or San Francisco or a capital city in Europe is remarkably similar. You'll find equivalent kind of groups. The one exception to this is probably that area of Manhattan where it is as of right. And there's really no planning process other than meeting the codes and meeting the as of right restrictions, which have been handed down over a long period of time and govern. And there are very powerful arguments, I think, in favor of that, because New York, with that as of right, has produced outstanding monuments of modern architecture. So it's not been completely kind of homogenized. And in that sense, remarkably similar cross-section to other cities. I think it's when you come to the big scale, big thinking projects, that's when you start to see the significant differences between those emerging Asian economies, of which China is very, very typical and dominant, where it does get streamlined in the national interests. And the investment in China in infrastructure, in high-speed mobility, is incredibly impressive. It's like education. I mean, it is investment for future generations. And that's what typified industrialized nations here in the 19th century was that ability to be able to think big and to be thinking beyond the short term, long-term thinking. And perhaps that's where the different political system starts to come in, because you're not thinking beyond a term of political office. You're thinking much bigger, much longer, much further ahead.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth. I'm an architect. I just wondered if you thought that the kind of less onerous health and safety legislation in China had anything to do with the relatively short construction period, and whether or not, as an architect, you felt any responsibility towards construction workers.
There's a remarkably the dramatic difference in the time taken by building an airport like Beijing with 50,000 people on site at any one time. The big difference is less in the period of construction. It's much more about decision making. Those big gaps between the construction, the approvals, the design, all of that's about indecision. It's about bouncing the ball down the, it's about not taking responsibility. The big difference is not really on the construction side. Would you agree with that, David and Luke? I mean,
I think it's also the way they are managed. I think it was the, Beijing airport. There was it was incredibly well managed. I mean, as Norman was saying, 40,000 workers, but they were being, incredibly well managed in divisions and constantly monitored. And I think a part of the challenge we had as well was to prefabricate as much as we could, so things could be produced, assembled off-site or to the side, so that there could be less dangerous work happening at one time. So I think it's a very important thing that we always think about when we're designing our buildings.
I mean, what tends to happen in this kind of exchange is that you start to think, and I never actually say, it's terribly simple. It's about attitude of mind, nothing else. So that project was driven by a guy called Commander Chen. And Commander Chen took us for a celebratory banquet to his restaurant, which was the Works Canteen, which is where he lived. He lived on site from day one to the last day. He never took a holiday, didn't even take Chinese New Year. And we never will know, but we had a very strong suspicion that in between our visits, it was the top leadership in the nation who were visiting the site and checking progress. So it's about attitude of mind. It's not about the time spent on the construction. It's not about a one-party system. It's not about health and safety, although there is a disparity of standards there. And that's inevitable, and that changes over time with evolution. But it's not about those things.
Do you think if you suggested to the City of London to have brought bamboo scaffolding to building your gherkin, they would raise the question of health and safety?
They might conclude that it was safer. I mean, there are all kinds of on-record instances of steel scaffolding which has not been able to withstand typhoons and had been blown away in the period in which the bank was being built. And the resilience of the bamboo to go with the forces of nature, I think you could make opposite arguments.
Carol Thatcher, I can see your gherkin from my roof terrace. A splendid addition it was to the London skyline.
Right, enough of oiling.
Okay. However, you said several times you're a global practice, and I wonder if you'd care to nominate a city skyline around the world, Shanghai or Dubai, or somewhere else, which you think best symbolises the innovation and brilliance of today's architects?
Oh my God.
Sorry.
I was just going to bounce it. I think the skyline of the emerging cities in China is totally evocative of progress, of investment, of a dynamic of urbanization. I'd say that those skylines have been made possible by a heritage, and that heritage is probably, has for me, a strong element of nostalgia. And so in a way, it is going back to the birthplaces of the tall building. And that's probably Chicago and New York. So they have a romantic allure. And in a way, particularly, well, Chicago perhaps more than Manhattan, because you can argue that Manhattan was pushed upwards by the confines of the rivers, that it's a narrow sliver of land. Of course, by virtue of being pedestrian friendly, with good public transport and a rich mix of activities which are layered one on top of the other, so it's not ghettoized in terms of the work area, the cultural area, the residential area. It is actually, in terms of its energy consumption, one of the world's most sustainable cities, interestingly. But Chicago, I think, is different because you have the Great Plains, and just for the hell of it, it goes up vertically. You know, you look at the Great Plains, and there's this great eruption, which I think comes right back to human nature. And that's why people climb mountains, it's why they build tall buildings, and why they love them. So there are lots of intellectual rationalizations, but in the end, it's like kids putting a brick on top of the other, until it falls down, and hell, you know, let's make another one.
Thank you.
We've only got about 3 minutes left, so I haven't had any question on this side. All right, so we'll have the last two questions on this side, that gentleman and the one without a tie.
Morning. I'm a lawyer, and I'll have a similarly compromising question as Ms. Thatcher's. In terms of, I was wondering what your favorite building was that wasn't constructed or designed by yourself and your team, and why that is the case.
It's probably completely off the cuff. It's probably any medieval cathedral, because in the end, it's about pushing the technology. It could, in an earlier question, be about any of the epic tall buildings, Empire State, Chrysler, and so on. But it's just the quest to reach for the skies and manifest in the tall building. It doesn't mean that my romance with architecture is confined to tall buildings. Quite the reverse. But probably I'd select that group of buildings. I mean, any one of them just, you know, moves the spirits, aside from the fact that they are spiritual buildings.
Yes. I mean, Chartres, for example, you're talking about 800 years, whatever. But do you think modern architecture will be able to stand up for 800 years?
I think some monuments will endure, but in the same way, the priceless buildings have been destroyed in the past. And in a way, it's less about what you destroy, it's more about what you replace it with.
All right, last question from there.
Good morning. We've been enthused by how you can work in China and the pace and how we've built infrastructure over there. What can we bring back to the UK here to kind of address our shortfall in infrastructure and in housing? You know, what would be the thing that you'd tell governments and designers, architects to do to kind of bring us back to level pegging with them?
I think it's exactly what we were proposing with the broad vision for the UK in terms of infrastructure, one component of which has been highlighted, and that was the Thames Hub airport. But remember that that was only a small part of a much wider ranging design for infrastructure, in that it was combined with a barrier at that location that would protect the Thames moving from that eastward location. So it would protect an area that would then allow for more housing between that location and the city centre, with a high-speed connection that would connect in the direction of Europe, as well as connecting and bypassing London to go north, so that it would spread wealth. It would be looking at a high-speed train, not in glorious isolation, but linking it in to a superhighway for information, cycle tracks, jogging trails, landscaping, and local transport, as well as long-distance high-speed. It was looking at connecting the ports. It was an overall holistic vision. It was also capturing tidal power to be able to drive the airport or drive massive housing development. So it was anticipating a future, and in the spirit of Hong Kong, where Kai Tak, replaced by Chet Lat Kok, became a kind of dream for a city that was hungry for land, and the Heathrow would be a golden opportunity for another Silicon Valley, a further expansion in relative terms of a compact city, rather than proliferating and destroying something which everybody takes for granted, which is the green belt. I mean, just compare the quality of the countryside, the demarcation between a town and the surrounding greenery. In this country, with probably any other European country, and particularly North America, you know, it's an extraordinary precious commodity, and it's taken for granted, dangerously taken for granted. So all of those are lessons from our wider experience, fed back.
So what are the idiots objecting to?
Ask the idiots.
One last question. Very last.
I'm Adriana. I would like to know which you think are the main have been the main difficulties to work for the Mexican airport compared to the Beijing airport.
Mexico?
Yes.
So far it's going very smoothly, so I don't have any complaints. It's very much a response to the site conditions, which is a kind of almost barely liquefied lake. So it's very soft ground. It's prone to earthquakes, and so it's quite tough and demanding. And what we've tried to do is, the airports that I showed you were really reinventions of an airport, and they started with London's third airport at Stansted, where we literally turned the conventional model of an airport upside down, let in natural light, lower energy, more joy, less maintenance. And we've used Mexico to, again, reinvent the airport. So it doesn't have a horizontal roof, it doesn't have vertical walls. It's like one gigantic, wonderful bubble. And because it is flexible, a bit like a bubble, it can start to move with these very poor soft soil conditions. And I wouldn't say blow in the wind, but let's say gracefully adapt to the Earth's tremors in seismic conditions.
Well, on that seismic note, I want you all to thank Lord Foster for that extremely articulate, exciting, stimulating, copious, enjoyable, enthusiastic, informative expose of a man's work which obviously has made an enormous impact on the world, and this is what makes us optimistic about how the world is going, even though there are so many bad things happening. And I hope that all of you have come here in the last hour to insulate yourself from the sadnesses around, just to enjoy this stimulating talk. And I want you all to join me very warmly to thank Lord Foster for sparing his time, his intelligence, and his articulation with us today.